Let me say something uncomfortable right away. Most of the advice you've been following didn't make you stronger. It trained you to be harmless. I know because I believed it too. I believed that if I stayed kind, worked harder than everyone else, and kept a positive attitude, life would eventually reward me. I thought patience was power and humility was leverage. That belief quietly weakened me. No one ever lied to my face, but no one told me the truth either. The truth is brutal, and Machiavelli understood it centuries ago. The world does not reward intention. It rewards signals. You can be honest, loyal, and exhausted, and still be invisible if none of that creates pressure or presence. I watched it happen in real time. I was the dependable one at work, the guy who fixed problems, stayed late, didn't complain. Meanwhile, people with less skill but stronger posture moved ahead. Promotions didn't go to the most sincere person in the room. They went to the person who looked costly to ignore. That's when something snapped for me. My goodness wasn't protecting me. It was labeling me. Machiavelli wasn't cynical. He was observant. He saw that systems respond to positioning, not purity. They don't care what you meant to do. They react to what you project and what happens if they don't take you seriously. I had been signaling compliance, not consequence, stability, not authority, and the system responded perfectly. It leaned on me instead of elevating me. That's the part that hurts to admit. The advice that sounds kind often keeps you weak. It teaches you how to endure, not how to matter. And if you never learn the difference, you'll spend years wondering why effort doesn't convert into progress. This video isn't about becoming cold or manipulative. It's about waking up before more time slips away. Because once you see that the world doesn't respond to who you are inside, only to what you signal outside, you stop waiting to be rewarded and start changing how you show up. The world doesn't respond to who you are. It responds to what you signal. Good intentions don't move the system. Position does. If this hits uncomfortably close, comment, relate. If the opening felt uncomfortable, this is where the discomfort starts to make sense. Machiavelli was never trying to turn people into villains. He was pointing out something far more dangerous. People judge by outcomes, not motives. They react to results, not intentions. That's the part most modern advice quietly avoids. Advice that sounds kind usually exists to keep things stable. It encourages cooperation, patience, and restraint because those traits make systems easier to manage. When someone tells you to stay positive, trust the process, or just keep your head down, it sounds supportive. But it often serves an existing order. It keeps you predictable. It keeps you calm. And most importantly, it keeps you non-threatening. Machiavelli understood that power structures don't reward goodness unless goodness creates pressure. If your presence doesn't change outcomes, your character becomes irrelevant. That's why so much advice feels comforting, but produces no movement. It helps you cope, not advance. Think about the workplace, the family, even social circles. The people who challenge the status quo are rarely encouraged to do so. They're told to be patient, to wait their turn, to trust the system. Not because the advice is evil, but because it protects stability. Advice that keeps everyone comfortable usually keeps you small. It teaches you how to fit without teaching you how to matter. Machiavelli warned that when advice never threatens your position, it's probably protecting someone else's. That doesn't mean every mentor is lying to you. It means most people give advice from their own comfort, not your future. They offer guidance that would have worked for them once they were already secure. But following that advice too early can lock you into roles that are useful, obedient, and replaceable. This is the backbone of everything that follows. The problem isn't bad intentions. It's misplaced loyalty to rules that were never designed to elevate you. Once you understand that advice is never neutral, you stop swallowing it whole. You start asking who benefits if you follow it. And that question alone begins to shift your position. So here's where things get personal. What I'm about to share are 5 pieces of advice I followed for years without questioning, because everyone around me treated them like common sense. I didn't realize they were shaping how small I played, how patiently I waited, and how little pressure I created. These ideas didn't ruin my life overnight. They just quietly trained me to accept less than I was capable of. This was the first piece of advice I accepted without resistance, because it sounded generous, modern, and empowering. You can be anything you want to be. I built years of my life around that sentence, letting it guide my choices, my identity, and the standards I used to judge myself. It felt humane, even noble, to believe that limitation was an illusion and that willpower alone could bend reality. I chased the version of success people applauded, the kind that photographs well and earns approval fast. I moved toward roles that looked impressive from the outside, but felt awkward and draining once I lived inside them. I forced confidence when my real strength was precision and depth. I chased leadership titles when my edge was quiet leverage and clear thinking. The harder I tried to stretch into every shape, the weaker my impact became in any single one. This advice doesn't collapse your life all at once. It erodes it slowly, by pulling you away from the place where you are naturally effective. I watched colleagues with fewer skills but clearer positioning move forward while I stayed busy, adaptable, and confused. I was praised for being versatile, flexible, and easy to work with. Compliments that sounded positive until I noticed they came without authority, influence, or protection. I wasn't respected for what I produced. I was valued for how easily I could be used. That realization hurt because it reframed my struggle. I wasn't unlucky, I was misaligned. When you try to become everything, you stop signaling anything specific. Power does not respond to intention. It responds to clarity. Systems reward those who fit a role cleanly, not those who wander between them. When the system cannot read you, it does not stop to understand you. It assigns you where effort is needed most. You become reliable labor instead of irreplaceable value. Once I saw that, I stopped asking who I should become and started asking where I consistently performed best. I narrowed my focus instead of expanding it. I sharpened my skills instead of diluting them. Slowly, effort began turning into outcomes instead of exhaustion. Opportunities didn't multiply, but relevance did. This advice sounds kind because it promises unlimited potential, but it quietly removes your edge by encouraging you to abandon it. The world does not reward boundless possibility. It rewards clear contribution delivered again and again, in the same direction, over time. When you stop chasing applause and start occupying the role that actually fits you, people respond differently. You become legible. You become harder to ignore, not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped hiding it behind borrowed ambition. This is the part that echoes an old, uncomfortable truth observed by Machiavelli. Strength is not moral, inspirational, or unlimited. Strength is contextual. It exists where nature, skill, and position align. That shift also changed how I felt day to day, because clarity reduces internal friction. Instead of waking up overwhelmed by options, I knew where to direct my energy. Decisions became simpler, not easier, because they were filtered through fit rather than fantasy. I stopped comparing myself to people built for different games. A friend of mine did the opposite for years, forcing himself into sales because it paid well, even though he hated persuasion. He burned out twice before accepting his strength was systems and analysis. Once he moved roles, his income dipped briefly, then surpassed where he had been, because he finally stopped fighting himself. Alignment creates momentum in quiet ways. It makes practice sustainable and improvement measurable. When effort compounds instead of scatters, confidence follows naturally. Not the loud kind, but the grounded kind that does not need validation. That is what most people miss. Freedom is not becoming anything you imagine. It is becoming effective where you actually are. Once you accept that, clarity replaces pressure, effort becomes deliberate, and progress stops feeling like constant self-betrayal, comparison, and noise from other lives. If you have ever tried to force yourself into a version of success that was never truly you, comment the thing you tried to become but could not sustain. Advice number 2 sounded responsible, mature, and safe when I first heard it. Make a plan, and everything will be fine. I didn't just like that idea. I built my identity around it. I mapped out a 5-year plan that looked clean on paper and reassuring when I explained it to other people. I knew what job I would take, how long I would stay, what skills I would stack, and where it was all supposed to lead if I stayed disciplined. Having a plan made me feel like I was in control, like effort plus patience would eventually equal security. Then life shifted, quietly at first, then all at once. The market changed, the industry evolved, the company restructured. People I relied on changed priorities, including me. Suddenly, the version of the future I had committed to no longer existed. Instead of adjusting, I froze. I stayed in roles that felt wrong, because leaving would mean admitting the plan was outdated. I ignored opportunities that didn't fit my timeline, even when they felt right, because they threatened the story I had already invested in. That's the hidden cost of rigid planning. It teaches you to defend decisions long after they stop serving you. I watched coworkers cling to paths that no longer made sense, telling themselves they just needed to be more patient. I watched others pivot early, quietly reposition, and move ahead while no one was paying attention. The difference wasn't intelligence or ambition. It was flexibility. Some people believe discipline can overpower uncertainty. Others expect the ground to shift and prepare accordingly. I learned the hard way that confusing structure with control is dangerous. Rigid plans break under chaos. The strong don't predict the future. They position for it. Once I stopped treating my plan like a contract and started treating it like a draft, everything changed. I began asking different questions. Instead of asking whether a move matched my original plan, I asked whether it expanded my options later. Did it give me skills that traveled across environments? Did it connect me to people beyond one ladder? Did it make me harder to replace if circumstances changed? Progress stopped looking neat, but it became real. I watched friends stay loyal to collapsing maps because abandoning them felt like failure. And I watched others let go early and build momentum in new directions. The world doesn't reward commitment to plans that no longer fit reality. It rewards responsiveness. Planning isn't the problem. Worshipping your plan is. When structure becomes identity, flexibility disappears. And when flexibility disappears, even small disruptions cause damage. I didn't lose time because my plan failed. I lost time because I defended it too long. Once I accepted that the future doesn't negotiate, I stopped trying to outthink it and started positioning myself to survive and grow inside it. That realization didn't make me reckless. It made me deliberate. I became less attached to appearances and more focused on resilience. I stopped explaining my plans and started strengthening my footing. When uncertainty showed up, I wasn't shocked. I was ready. The habit of revising my direction became normal, not dramatic. Over time, that flexibility rebuilt confidence in a quieter way. I trusted myself to respond, not to predict. That trust removed fear from change and replaced it with movement. I no longer waited for certainty before acting. I acted to create it. The more I practiced adapting, the less control I needed to feel secure. Progress returned slowly, then steadily, because I was finally moving with reality instead of arguing against it daily. The third piece of advice didn't confuse me, it embarrassed me. Follow your passion. I heard it so often that I assumed everyone else had something figured out that I didn't. When I couldn't point to one thing that lit me up every day, I internalized it as a flaw, like I was missing a core feature everyone else was born with. I thought passion was the fuel, and without it, I was running empty before I even started. That belief pushed me into constant motion. I explored, pivoted, rebranded myself, and chased interests the way people chase trends, hoping one of them would finally stick and give me a clean answer. Instead of clarity, I felt scattered. Instead of motivation, I felt tired. The pressure to feel inspired made everything heavier than it needed to be. I wasn't struggling because the work was hard. I was struggling because I kept questioning whether I was supposed to be doing it at all. Eventually, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. Excitement is unreliable. Feelings don't scale. The people who build real momentum aren't waiting to feel ready. They're willing to endure boredom, discomfort, and repetition long enough for skill to form. Passion is emotional. Virtue is strategic. When I shifted my focus from what I loved to what I could tolerate consistently, my path stabilized in a way it never had before. I started noticing patterns in my own behavior that I had ignored for years. The work I kept returning to even when it felt dull. The problems I was willing to wrestle with without external praise or attention. The effort I didn't quit just because it stopped feeling special. That was the real signal. Not excitement, not inspiration, but persistence without drama. Around me, the difference became obvious once I knew what to look for. Friends who followed passion chased novelty, burning bright at the start, then burning out just as fast when friction appeared. Others picked something hard but survivable and stayed with it long enough to become dangerous at it. They weren't happier every day, but they were moving forward. Skill accumulated quietly. Reputation followed naturally. Options expanded over time. The world rewards endurance, not excitement. I saw it in my own routine as well. On days I waited for motivation, nothing happened. On days I acted anyway, something compounded, even if it was small. Discipline didn't feel inspiring, but it removed friction. Repetition didn't feel meaningful, but it created progress you could measure weeks later. Endurance didn't look impressive, but it built trust with myself, which turned out to matter more than confidence ever did. Once I stopped judging my lack of passion and started respecting my capacity to persist, my confidence changed shape. It became quieter and more grounded. I didn't need every task to feel meaningful or aligned with some imagined calling. I just needed to know I could keep going when it stopped being fun. That shift also changed how others treated me. Consistency made me reliable. Reliability made me valuable. Value created influence without noise or self-promotion. People stopped asking how passionate I was and started trusting what I could deliver. The advice to follow your passion sounds liberating, but it often traps people in waiting mode, hoping clarity will arrive before action. And hope without movement is expensive. When you commit to what you can carry instead of what excites you, effort stops feeling like resistance and starts feeling deliberate. Progress no longer depends on mood or inspiration. It depends on follow-through. Over time, this way of working reshaped my days and my standards. I stopped chasing sparks and started building stamina. I stopped asking what felt exciting and started asking what I could sustain for years without breaking. That decision didn't make life easier, but it made it stable. Stability created room for growth that excitement never did. And it gave me something passion never offered, momentum that didn't disappear when feelings changed. If you've ever kept doing something difficult long after the excitement faded, comment one hard thing you still show up for when no one is watching. Some advice doesn't come at you as pressure. It comes as expectation. And you absorb it so early, you forget you ever chose it. You feel it the moment you hesitate to speak honestly because you don't want to be seen as difficult, negative, or ungrateful. That's exactly how advice number 4 settles into your life. Always stay positive. I adopted that mindset early and wore it like proof that I was emotionally mature, stable, and easy to work with. I learned to smooth over frustration before it turned into questions. I learned to reframe disappointment instead of investigating it. I learned to smile through situations that quietly drained me, because I thought that was what strength looked like. On the surface, it made life easier. People liked me. Conflict stayed low. Underneath, it slowly disconnected me from reality. Every time something felt wrong, I told myself it was a mindset issue. Every time progress slowed, I reminded myself to be grateful. That habit didn't make me resilient, it made me passive. Optimism without clarity is blindness. The discomfort I kept pushing away wasn't noise, it was information, and I was training myself to ignore it. I saw it clearly at work. When a role stopped stretching me, I told myself to stay positive. When boundaries were crossed, I minimized it so I wouldn't seem sensitive. When my values started flattening, I reframed it as patience and told myself, good things take time. That mindset kept me calm, but it also kept me stagnant. Pain reveals information. Ignore it and you lose position. I watched friends do the same thing in different forms. People smiling through jobs that slowly erase their confidence. People reframing burnout as growth. People calling deep misalignment a temporary phase that somehow lasted for years. Anyone who voiced frustration was told to adjust their attitude, as if awareness itself was the problem. That's where this advice becomes dangerous. It trains you to distrust your own signals and outsource judgment to whatever keeps the peace. Once I stopped forcing optimism, I didn't become bitter or dramatic. I became accurate. I started listening to irritation instead of suppressing it. Frustration pointed to friction. Boredom pointed to stagnation. Anxiety pointed to misplacement. Those emotions weren't weaknesses. They were early warnings my body and attention were sending before things broke completely. Acting on them didn't make me unstable. It made me precise. I changed environments that demanded constant emotional performance just to survive. I stopped tolerating situations that required me to lie to myself in order to stay comfortable. People responded differently when I stopped masking discomfort and started adjusting behavior. Expectations shifted because I was clearer. Boundaries held because I stopped apologizing for them. Respect increased quietly, without confrontation or speeches. The world doesn't reward blind positivity. It responds to people who see clearly and move accordingly. I've watched people lose years because they refused to admit something wasn't working, all in the name of staying positive and patient. I've also watched people move forward quickly once they allowed themselves to acknowledge discomfort without turning it into drama or complaint. The difference wasn't attitude, it was honesty. There's a difference between complaining and observing. One wastes energy by looping, the other directs energy toward change. Advice number 4 sounds kind and mature, but it often teaches people to tolerate conditions that slowly weaken them while calling it growth. Clarity, even when uncomfortable, creates leverage. I didn't progress by smiling more or reframing harder. I progressed by seeing more and responding earlier. When you stop lying to yourself, you don't become harsh or cynical. You become accurate. And accuracy changes outcomes, timing, and how the world responds to you. If you've ever forced positivity instead of acting on a clear warning sign, comment one moment ignoring discomfort cost you time. There's a moment when ambition quietly turns into comparison, and you don't even notice it happening at first. One day you're focused on improving. The next you're convinced the reason you're behind is because you don't have the right connections. That belief grows subtly through advice number 5. Success is about who you know. I accepted that idea without much resistance, mostly because it explained my frustration without forcing me to question my direction or effort. If opportunity lived inside closed circles, then my problem wasn't skill or consistency, it was access. So I made access my goal. I showed up to rooms where I felt out of place. I kept conversations going that didn't actually matter. I collected contacts the way people collect hope, assuming quantity would eventually turn into leverage. None of it made me feel stronger. It made me feel dependent. I was always reaching outward, rarely building inward. Over time, that approach drained my confidence in ways I couldn't name at the time. I was visible, but not essential. I knew faces, but I wasn't needed. What changed my perspective wasn't a book, a quote, or a mentor sitting me down. It was observation. I started paying attention to who actually got pulled into opportunities. The people with the most access weren't chasing relationships at all. They were being sought out. Their names came up when problems needed solving. They weren't impressive in conversation. They were reliable in action. That's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Reputation precedes access. Doors weren't opening because of networking. They were opening because of usefulness. Become useful, and doors open quietly. I saw this clearly with a friend who avoided networking almost entirely. He didn't attend mixers or try to stay visible. He focused on mastering a technical skill most people found boring and frustrating. When issues came up, leadership didn't ask who he knew or how well he communicated. They asked where he was. Invitations followed without effort, without pitching, without self-promotion. Meanwhile, others kept chasing introductions, hoping proximity would substitute for contribution. The contrast was impossible to miss. Once I stopped believing relationships were something to pursue and started seeing them as something to earn, my behavior shifted. I invested in depth instead of breadth. I chose one area to become undeniably competent instead of 10 areas to sound interesting. I stopped asking how to get in front of people and started asking how to become difficult to ignore. Over time, people started reaching out with real conversations and concrete opportunities. I wasn't asking for time anymore. I was being offered it. The truth most people don't want to admit is that networking before you're valuable puts you in a weaker position. The one being chased always has more leverage than the one doing the chasing. I've watched people spend years cultivating connections without building substance, always busy, always hopeful, always replaceable. I've also watched others quietly attract powerful allies by doing work that mattered, work that solved real problems, work that spoke before they did. The difference wasn't personality or confidence. It was utility. Advice number 5 sounds practical, even realistic, but it often encourages people to externalize responsibility for their future. It teaches them to look outward for progress instead of inward for capability. Relationships matter, but they amplify what already exists. They don't replace it. When you stop hunting for access and start building reputation, progress becomes less noisy and more consistent. You no longer need to convince anyone or sell potential. Your work does that for you, quietly and repeatedly. Before you take this and turn it into anger or cynicism, pause for a second. Not everyone who gave you advice wanted to hurt you. Most people shared what helped them survive, what kept them liked, what kept them safe. But survival advice and truth are not the same thing. And very few people have the courage to admit how the world actually responds to behavior. This video was never about becoming cold or manipulative. It was about becoming awake. Once you stop treating life like a moral test and start seeing it as a system, confusion begins to lift. You understand why effort didn't always turn into progress, why patience sometimes kept you small, and why being agreeable often made you invisible. None of this means virtue is useless. It means virtue without leverage is fragile. The uncomfortable part is responsibility. Responsibility for how you are perceived. Responsibility for what you tolerate. Responsibility for the position you accept again and again. When you take that responsibility, life stops feeling random. You may not control outcomes, but you control preparation. You control whether you are adaptable or brittle, useful or ignored, chosen or convenient. That awareness changes how you move. You stop waiting to be noticed. You stop hoping fairness will arrive. You start building signals the world actually responds to. This doesn't require cruelty or ego. It requires honesty. Honest assessment of where you create value. Honest recognition of when something is no longer working. Honest willingness to move before resentment builds. That's why most advice stays shallow. Truth disrupts comfort. It forces people to admit they've been playing by rules that were never designed to reward them. If Machiavelli were alive today, he wouldn't be shocked by the world. He would be amused by how little it has changed. The world doesn't reward virtue. It rewards leverage. Learn the game or keep being played. If something in this video made you pause, reframe, or see your past differently, comment awake. And if you want to keep learning how the game actually works instead of being fed advice that just sounds good, subscribe and stay here. This awareness is not about becoming ruthless or losing empathy. It is about precision. Precision in choosing where to invest time. Precision in deciding when to stay and when to leave. Precision in understanding that silence, boundaries, and preparation are forms of power too. When you see the game clearly, you don't need to announce change. You adjust quietly. You stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You stop overperforming for validation and start building quiet advantages that compound. That is how confidence becomes grounded instead of loud. That is how progress becomes steady instead of dramatic. Nothing mystical, nothing cruel, just clarity applied consistently over time. That shift changes relationships, work, and self-respect. Because you no longer chase approval, you generate gravity. And people respond differently when certainty replaces hope over time without forcing outcomes or seeking permission.